line with us our buddy Phil Ittner, the veteran war correspondent, generally based in Kyiv, Ukraine. He's got a YouTube video blog. Just look for his name. It's Philip Ittner, Philipittner. That's also his Twitter handle, Philip Ittner. And Phil, welcome back to the program. I understand you've been up on the front lines in the last couple of days. And A, how are you? And B, how is Ukraine doing right now?
Well, I'm fine, Tom. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I was out in Donbas for the last 3 days, and including going up to just at the edge of the encircled or nearly encircled town of Bakhmut, where the fighting is most intense. I went to a little town that is just down the road from Bakhmut called Chasiv Yar, and we saw a large collection, a concentration of Ukrainian forces, many actually utilizing U.S.-provided vehicles. And we heard an awful lot and saw an awful lot of outgoing artillery from Ukrainian forces, but not a lot of incoming artillery from Russian forces. And it does look as though Bakhmut is nearly encircled by Russian forces, most predominantly the private military group called the Wagner Group, headed by a man named Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's a friend of Vladimir Putin's. But Bakhmut is not completely encircled. And what we were able to see on the ground there was that the Ukrainians do appear to be concentrating their forces in what may very well be the early planning stages for a counteroffensive. So things are very active out in Donbas. It's going to it's going to the front lines, and it's dangerous, and you get a very good impression of what's happening there. The civilians, of course, caught in the middle. We saw a lot of people leaving. We saw, a lot of damage to civilian infrastructure. But the fight for Bakhmut is not over, and I suspect we, as I say, may see a counteroffensive very soon. On my way back from Donbas, I stopped in, sadly, at the site of the Izium mass grave site, where it is believed war crimes were committed, or evidence of war crimes were found. And it is, it's heartbreaking, Tom. It's devastating to know that people can do that to one another. And it reinforces my belief that Ukraine needs to expel the Russian forces, and that ultimately there needs to be accountability. And I know that in the International Criminal Court in The Hague today, it's been announced that an investigation into Russian war crimes is officially being launched. That's
good news. That's good news. The New York Post is reporting, the headline is Russia loses 1,090 soldiers in reported deadliest day of war. This was Saturday. So it seems that Ukraine is fighting back. Is this aggressively? Is this the result of a new infusion of weapons from the West, or is this just they're doing good? They've got a what would you say, a highly incentivized military as a consequence of their country having been invaded by a foreign country.
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors that are coming into play here, Tom, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it's an enormous motivator for the Ukrainian people. I spent some time with some training, Ukrainian soldiers who were training today in the town that I'm currently in, which is Kharkiv, just on the border of Donbas. And yes, I think that's part of it, the fact that they're motivated to fight, and so they are willing to defend, ferociously the land that they hold, and also to try and regain the land. I saw definitely that Western supplied weapon systems, vehicles are on the front line. The latest group, that kind of the much anticipated fourth generation tanks that have been promised, those aren't quite here yet. I know that there are Bradley fighting vehicles in country. We did not see them in the Bakhmut frontline area. There are complaints of a lack of ammunition from the Ukrainians. But when you talk about the vast numbers of Russian soldiers that are dying, it does seem to correspond with what we saw on the Bakhmut front line is that there is a vast disproportional amount of artillery exchanges going on. The Ukrainians are, despite the complaints of the lack of ammunition, they have enough to shoot into Bakhmut at, I would say, a 10-to-1 ratio. I was there on the front lines for about 3 hours on, I believe it was Saturday. And in that period of time, we heard a lot of outgoing Ukrainian artillery, but not a lot of incoming from the Russians. So they're pounding Bakhmut. And then at the same time, they're also sending in more troops. Again, that's that motivation factor we talked about. And then also it's worth noting that they're also building up secondary and tertiary defensive lines, that if the Russians do succeed in Bakhmut, and war is a fickle mistress, and battles can be won and lost on a razor's edge, that should Bakhmut fall to the Wagner Group and the Russian military, really all they're going to get is a demolished town, and then they will find themselves fighting about 5 kilometers down the road another entire line of defensive positions the Ukrainians are preparing. So there will be no massive breakout, even if they take Bakhmut, which is kind of strategically placed in a lot of different, it's a hub for transport. But even if they are able to, the Russians are able to grab Bakhmut, there will not be a massive breakout of armor, sweeping into some of the urban centers of eastern Ukraine. I have to say, Tom, things don't look good for the Russians because as they're bogged down in all this, all those Western weapons are coming online. They're being sent here. And I have to admit, having seen those hundreds of holes in the ground at the Izium mass grave sites, I find myself lacking in compassion for those Russian soldiers who are here. And I hope they just turn around and go home.
Yeah. I mean, we're all human beings here. This is a tragedy all the way around. I'm curious if this is a tempest in a teapot or actually a big deal. The Russian Foreign Ministry just is freaking out, apparently, about what they refer to as the Supreme Nazi of Kyiv, which would be Mr. Zelensky. Considering a petition proposing to rename Russia as Moscovia and the Russian Federation to the Moscow Federation. This is apparently an old name for Russia. And what is this like, renaming Tennessee, Hillbillyville or something? I mean, is it a slur or is it something historic? I mean, what's going on?
Without going into a really deep, because the history here is so very dense, without kind of going into a massive history lesson, the identity of being Russian, Rus, was actually born in Kiev. It wasn't born in Moscow. And when the Mongol invasion happened, the people who identified as being Rus relocated to Moscow, and they became basically the bagmen for the Mongols. And so then they adapted. Once Kiev had been sacked, they took on the mantle of Rus. And so what this is, Tom, is trolling on a truly epic level. And this is the Ukrainians knowing exactly how to get under the skin of the Russians. And so to diminish their mantle of being the motherland of the Rus, the Russians, right, which again was originally Kievan, they are depriving them of this great nation status, which the Russians believe themselves to be inheritors of. And they know exactly what they're doing. Zelensky knows exactly what they're doing. Yeah. This wasn't Zelensky's idea. This was proposed. But it's genius. It's genius, and I love the fact that the Russians are spinning.
And it seems that this would be a rebuttal in part to Putin's recent assertion that Ukraine actually has no right to exist as an independent country, because when that Viking from Sweden first established what became Rus in Kyiv, that it's always been part of Russia. Therefore, is this the rebuttal to that?
In many ways, yes. I mean, earlier in the war, there was a whole big thing about how At one point, it is interesting to note that Kiev was one of the fifth largest human settlements on the European continent, and around the 9th, 10th century. It was an enormous place, and it was hugely significant in the development of Europe. And the Ukrainians did something very similar then as to what they're doing now, because they would put out things of saying, when we were one of the largest settlements in Europe, Moscow was nothing but a forest. And it's true. Historically, it's factually, it's right. But it just drives the Russians nuts when the Ukrainians kind of note that they are the birthplace of their cultural identity. And to have somebody like Putin or the hard right in Russia saying that Ukraine doesn't deserve to even have an identity, that they are the ones who own the custodianship of what it is to be Russian, or even Slavic for that matter, is something that when Ukrainians stand up and say, well, actually, our history has much more of a rich tapestry than yours, the Russians go absolutely ballistic. And part of this is, this is one of the reasons why the Russians do want to diminish Ukrainian national identity, because there is this competition about what does it mean to be Slavic? What does it mean to be Orthodox in the Orthodox Church? And Ukrainians contend that they, as much as anybody, have a right to define who they are, whether it is Slavic, Orthodox, Catholic, European, all these factors that make up Ukraine. And Russia would have you believe, or have the world believe, and even the Ukrainians themselves believe, that no, you're just a subset of what we define as Slavic. And that's why this fight is so important for the Ukrainians, because it is an existential question. Who are we? And the Ukrainians have decided we get to write that book.
Right. Who are we? And do we get to exist, continue to exist as an independent nation and people? Philip Ittner, I-T-T-N-E-R on YouTube.
I'll be putting pictures up for both the front lines and for the horrific site in Israel of the mass grave. So I'll be putting those up.
Thom Hartmann Program.
Okay, thank you, Phil.